Welcome. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for attending our first Coffee with a Curator. This is a session that's really meant to just allow our visitors and our members to sit down with our curators and hear what they're working on during this strange time. It's a way to connect our membership to our curators and hear a little bit about their current projects. Jennifer Lemmer Posey. She is the Tibbles Curator of Circus. And she's gonna just share a little bit about the history of the Ringling family and how they started the early circus. So I'm gonna turn it over to Jennifer. She's gonna share her screen and we'll go from there. Thank you, Jennifer, for doing this for us.
Of course, I am excited to be here. And like I said before, I'm thrilled to see so many of you here with me and familiar faces. It's nice. I've missed our museum community and I think we all feel that. So when Laura and Aaron and I started talking about programming opportunities, we thought, well, having a space where we could come together, and particularly with this group who have all given so much of themselves to the museum, seemed like a great opportunity. So we thought we would do something that seemed informal and open this up as a way that we can have conversations. As I mentioned at the start, I started putting together a PowerPoint and it grew longer than I meant it to. So I'm gonna walk through it. It's kind of more about how I think and how I research, and I hope that you'll learn something that you can use during this time where we're all stuck at home a little more than we care to be, to do some of your own research, your own interests. But as I go through, if there are moments, feel free to raise your hand in some way and get attention. I know that Laura and Aaron both are looking out for me, and I don't mind being interrupted if the question is timely, or I'm trying to build it so that we'll have more time to kind of talk back and forth towards the end of the presentation. But like I said, I don't think this has to be super formal, so please participate however you feel comfortable. So I threw out topics that I thought would be really easy for me to talk to a little bit off the top of my head because they're the ones that I always am dealing with. And obviously the Ringling family circus story is core. It's one of the most important stories we tell here because it explains how the museum came about. It's the backstory for John and his brothers. And working on the reinstallation project, I needed to think about that story and think about how that's going to shape up in the galleries, and we're going to continue adding pieces to it there. So it's a great excuse for me to constantly be digging a little bit deeper. So thinking about this program and actually just thinking about working from home, I frantically started grabbing books off of my shelves, which ironically now are at home and not here. But I thought I'm going to take a picture of some of this because these are kind of, especially the ones that are off to the right, are really the core books that I go to when I start any kind of Ringling research. The David Weeks book is here. The Henry Ringling North book, The Circus Kings, is his viewpoint on the family. And the Ringlingville is an amazing volume. And then I don't have on that shelf The Life Story of the Ringling Brothers by Alf T because I actually have a Kindle version of that. And if you are using Kindle at all, you can buy that book for $1.99 on Amazon. It's a great read. It's a lot of fun. And it's always my first stop when I start looking into the very early history of the brothers, because while I don't think Alf T wrote every single word of it, it is something that came out as an official biography of the brothers from themselves. So it's an important resource. The ones off to the left, I want to be clear, whenever I start thinking about circus, obviously things like Freakery and Staring are more about sideshow, but all of those books start to inform how I think about all of the circus topics, so I like to keep them all together. So anyway, back to Alf T's book. When I was looking to start the label writing for the historic galleries, I went back to this book and just really started reading it again for the first time in a few years. And as always, I was struck by the talk of this first circus. You know, part of the great Ringling mythology is that the boys as children went to the circus, and that really triggered something, that made them want to be showmen in a way that really informed everything else they did. So because I love circus history, I am always trying to figure out what was that first circus. So the book describes them huddled together, waiting at the water's edge for this circus. We know from Alf T's book that the first circus that the boys saw, the one they credit with inspiring them, was seen while they lived in McGregor, Iowa. And we know that they were in McGregor from 1860 until 1872. We know that John was very young when they saw the circus, but he was old enough to go off into the world with his brothers. So that leads me to think he's at least a toddler. Henry Ringling North's book says that he's 4 years old, but he doesn't actually give anything to tell us, exactly why 4 is the number. I know that John was born in 1866, and I know that Alf described waiting for a riverboat circus. So I have these pieces of information from the narrative that give me some parameters to look for what circus they might have been looking for. And then I go to one of my favorite resources. I don't know how many of you out there are familiar with the Library of Congress's Chronicling America page, but you're going to learn about it today because it really is, I think, one of the greatest resources. It is accessible to all of you. You can get to this, and I'll add that I'm putting together a PDF of this presentation that once I have it at a size that can be emailed, I'm going to ask education to share with you all. It will have these links embedded in it, so don't feel like you have to worry about collecting anything along the way. We'll send it back out to you. So this site is a massive digitization project, and they are digitizing historic newspapers, as you can see up here, from 1789 up through 1963. It's ongoing, so those dates actually are always kind of sliding. And they are papers from all across the United States. So it's a great place to go get overview information about any topic that you might be interested in. In this case, I'm trying to find out about that circus that the boys would have seen. So I thought I would go through the search parameters with you because it's this site, the more specific you can be about how you search, the more you're going to be able to learn from it. So as an example, I'm going to go down. I know that they were in Iowa, and I always use this date range because the one up here that just has the years never actually seems to limit things as much as I want it to. So I know they were in Iowa, and I know the dates have to be between 1867, because that would mean John's at least 1.
And Jennifer, sorry to interrupt. Are you showing us the actual search engine in real time right now?
I am, yes.
Okay, we're just seeing your PowerPoint screen. So I think when you go to the select for the screen share, it should give you a couple of different options. If you select your internet browser rather than the PowerPoint, we'll be right there with you.
Okay, thank you for telling me that. Yeah, please. Oh, you're right, sharing is paused. Look at that. So the Library of Congress just in general has all kinds of great online resources. But the Chronicling America site, and Laura, thank you very much for pointing that out. If what I'm saying doesn't jive with what you're seeing on the screen, let me know. So here we go. This is what I was looking at. This is the Chronicling America landing page. All it is chroniclingamerica.loc.gov. And again, that link will be in materials that we'll send out to you later. And I went into this advanced search field, and here you can limit by state. So I went down to Iowa, and then limiting by date. As I mentioned, this field doesn't seem to always hold when I do searches, so I prefer to go in this way and do a search for the years that I'm looking for. So 1867, and then you have to be careful to click a date. And then I'm going to limit it to 1872 because I know that they've left McGregor by that point. I have to move some windows off of my screen. There we go. 31. And then I'm going to do a search for the word circus because I don't know what circus it was, but I feel pretty confident that it's going to have that term in any article that I would hope to look at. So you'll get these results. And at the moment, I've searched the entire state of Iowa. And so under the term results, you can see I've turned back 927 of them. When I have tons of time, I will actually spend that going through because I think it can be really interesting, to look at how circuses are advertising themselves throughout the state. I also get really excited to see what performers are with any given show. So I can use the time to do that. And I'm looking at a newspaper page. Then this one is the Tipton Advisor from Tipton in Cedar County, Iowa, and it's from 1871. And so you can get a sense of the way circuses were advertising, but this doesn't help me get back to the brothers. So going back to my search results, what I do is go to the advanced search, and happily it's held the dates that I had and the search term. Now, I've done enough of the digging through that initial search for Iowa to know that McGregor had its own newspaper in that time period. It's the North Iowa something. So I'm going to go down and select a specific newspaper name. I'm going to run that same search. And so now I only have 61 results for that whole time period, which feels much more approachable. You know, you can spend the time looking through these and getting to know kind of what you would expect. Now, I did that already, so I'm going to save us a little bit of time and go to this particular page. This one had jumped off that thumbnail view to me for a lot of reasons, but mainly because it has this wonderful image at the top. Most of them don't take up so much space with an image, and very few of the images are anywhere near as complicated as this one for George DeHaven's Imperial Circus. So we see here a riverboat, which is kind of a good sign, right? May 27th, 1868. So John is right around 2. Seems manageable in that time period. Maybe a 2-year-old would be sent off with his older brothers to go out in the world. So it starts to click some of the boxes. It doesn't fit everything that the brothers describe, but it's this sense that this is possibly a circus they would have seen. And George DeHaven ran a very big, important circus in the Midwest in this time period. So you can see some of the kinds of acts that would have been with the show, and they were performing in McGregor. I love Senor Charles Bliss, who was doing a ceiling walk. That was a big act in the time. Some of them were done with hoops, which is probably what his was. They don't show it in that picture. So this seems like it's, you know, possibly one of the shows that the brothers could have seen. What I love about this particular newspaper is that when you go to the next page in the paper itself, and you scroll down, and you zoom in a little, we have an ad here for August Ringling's harness shop. So it kind of nicely ties together the idea that the Ringlings were engaged with this newspaper. They would have seen it. The DeHaven show may or may not have been the circus that's described in a lot of the early stories of the Ringlings, but it has a chance of being that. So I'm gonna flip back to my PowerPoint now if I can figure out how to do that. Okay, so I included in this presentation just these searches that I did so that if you're going back and wanted to look at them, you would have kind of the parameters or a reminder of how we did that. So reading further into Alf T. Ringling's story, and this is one I love. Alf T. describes this performer that came in with the circus that they had been waiting for on the riverfront. And he was a local performer. He was a resident of McGregor, a cannonball juggler, and everybody in town was really excited that he had returned and that he was one of the stars of the show. So this performer had a certain apparatus for this balancing perch act that he did, and so that's where someone stands on the ground and holds a long pole while someone else performs poses on the top. And the belt and socket on this apparatus needed repairing. So he is allegedly the performer that came to the harness shop to get that repaired. So let me see how I did this. So now, along with all these other pieces of information, I know that the circus included a cannonball juggler and a strongman who was from McGregor. So when I go back to my search, and I put in the same parameters. So I'm going to go back to the North Iowa Times. You guys are so quiet. If you have any questions, please let me know. And I'm going to do those same dates. And because I have done this before and I want to keep moving, I'm going to put in the name of that performer. And then sometimes it's not going to give you back what you want. Take off. Yes. What did I do wrong?
What's your newspaper?
Did I select the wrong newspaper? Was that it? There it is. Okay, so we got the dates. There we go. Let me sort it. Where did he go? Nope, not that one. All right, guys, that's better, but I was a little thrown by moving about. So while I am trying to find the marvelous newspaper that I found that got me so excited, I'm also, well, you're going to have to bear with me because I'm apparently not good at talking and searching at the same time. Go back here.
I think if anything, Jennifer, it's helpful for us to see, you know, how the search engine works in real time, and that sometimes you have to wade through quite a bit to find what you're looking for. So this is actually really helpful.
Well, good. I hope so. And it is true. You really, when I do these kinds of searches, one, I screw them up sometimes. I put in the wrong phrases, or I'm not paying careful attention, but also sometimes you just have to play with what words you use to try and get kind of a limited search. So I happen to know the referred to, and so that I put in the term Andy along with circus, so I was able to limit it. So in this paper, which, let's go back up, is from August 7th, 1867, we have this really great ad for the Orton Brothers Great American Circus. And you can see the Orton Brothers were known as being great equestrians, and they're advertising their various acts. You see a lot of mentions of the family themselves, Den Orton and Miles Orton, his brother. So this newspaper ad, along with all of these features of the Orton family and their main performers, has gone out of its way to focus on otherwise Big Andy. And you can see this wonderful little image of this man standing with two perch poles supporting performers. So Andy is positively the greatest Herculean of the age. So again, there's a nice focus there, and there is exactly the act that was described. And then when you go back to the other search results from that day, and we have August 7th, 1867. Here is the next one, date, which might help me keep this more organized. So it defaults to sorting everything by relevance. So the ones that have the most of your search terms are going to be there. But then when you sort it by date, you can start to see relationships between various ones. And so actually it's in the same page now that I think about it. In the newspaper itself, it's talking about various circuses and shows that are coming through, which is interesting. But here, this text about the Circus of the Orton Brothers will be here Tuesday next. And down here, Mr. Gaffney, how odd it sounds to call him Mr. He's Big Andy, the favorite of McGregor, the excellent actor, the Herculean in size and strength. And they're so excited about him coming. Andy, darling, may the devil fly off with me if I don't borrow $1 or $2 to see you play with those balls that you handle so innately. I don't know what that means, but the juggling of the cannonballs. So McGregor is celebrating this performer coming back. And so it plays out this story that Alf has told in various ways. But these different kinds of research lead me and have led other circus historians to believe that really what the Ringlings were looking at was a combination of, or what they were remembering was a combination of circuses that they had seen in their youth. But I loved being able to find that reference to Big Andy. So through the research that I've done, I can see that Big Andy was there with the Orton brothers in 1867. George DeHaven had that riverboat in his advertising in 1868. And Big Andy came back again in 1869 with this circus, John Stowe's. It was much smaller, and the circus business at that time was less. So I'm suspecting the Orton brothers might be the one that really, was referenced in terms of that particular performer. So along with that, and I had to throw in this poster because it's one of my favorites in the Tibbles collection, and it's for some of the Ortons. So Miles Orton, who was mentioned in that ad, is seen here in the bottom corner, and he would perform with his children in this balancing riding act. So this poster is 1884, significantly later than the Ringlings would have seen it, but it still gives a sense of the kinds of circus acts that they would have been watching. So I mentioned these different circuses that have come into McGregor. In 1867, there were a lot of circuses that came through that little town. You had 3 of them over the course of the summer. In 1870, it slows down and you only see DeHaven's circus make a stop in McGregor, according to the newspapers. That took me on a little side tilt where I started reading. I wondered what had changed in the national economy to make circuses slow down. Was there a reason there were less? And apparently 1869, there is a Black Friday that is the result of when Jay Gould and Mr. Fisk, I can't remember his first name, tried to buy up all of the national gold supply. And so confidence was lost in the banks, and there was a crash and there was a recession. So 1870, McGregor saw less circuses. And at the same time, their father's harness work slows down, and that's why they move in 1872, because the work just isn't there. So it's this wonderful way, if you look for patterns or strange things happening in this information, you can learn that much more about what's going on both in the nation and with the circus. So one of the books—
Is there anything about the Dan Rice Circus? We had some notes in the class that the Ringling brothers were inspired by the Dan Rice show. And do you have anything about that?
That was the most perfect timing. That was why I brought up this text. If you look at the text in the center, Charles Ringling wrote that they watched Dan Rice come up the river that morning in May. And so Dan Rice, I went and did the search, and you do see Dan Rice coming later in 1869. He does come through McGregor. So again, he's not on a boat though. As best I can tell, he's an overland show, so traveling by wagons. Okay. So I still think it's a little bit of a combination of things that came together. But that was what interested me, is every time you go into this story, you find kind of a different turn on it. This book by Gene Plowden, The Amazing Ringlings and Their Circus, is one that I honestly had never really sat down and read until this past week, but it was one that I grabbed off the shelves because I thought I should at least look at it. Gene Plowden was a PR man, and he worked out of Sarasota. He met John Ringling in his very latter years and talked with John and got a lot of circus stories, and then did his work. He did his research and tried to pick up what he could. But of course, he's writing this book, I think is published in the 60s, 68. So it's not the same kind of resources that we can access today. And Plowden's book is tremendously readable. It could be like a screenplay for a movie, but it also has a really strong tilt towards John's side of the story. So while he brought up the story of Dan Rice, who did definitely go through their area, Plowden also starts out his narrative talking about John Ringling going to see John B. Doris's Great Interocean Circus. So you see all these words in the text. And it's possible that John went to see Doris's show. It would have been when he was, in Plowden's text, he says John was 17. And Doris did play Watertown, Wisconsin, which is a little ways away from Baraboo, but he could have gotten there. So he did play that area at that time. But Plowden uses it as this kind of moment that John himself really understood how how exciting life could be as the owner of a circus. So you see him describing here, the proprietor of the Great Inner Ocean, with an assist from the artist, was a downright handsome man with a round, expressive face. And John watched him talking to people and saw his influence. So there's some idea that made an impression to him of kind of what his life would be like if they did very well with the circus. So again, looking at those resources, I can see that it's possible he saw this show, but it would have been a stretch. So those are kind of the ways I've been exploring the Ringling Circus story. We invited some questions from all of you when we sent out the invitation to this talk. And so I'm going to kind of jump into some of those and work through those to show you some of the other resources that I use and that you can access to do research on a lot of different kinds of history. So one of the questions was, I would like to know more about the early days of the Ringling Brothers Circus in Baraboo. How far did they travel in those years? We have the coolest resource that we've been working on with Circus World Museum in Baraboo, Wisconsin, and the Milner Special Collections Library. And that, let me see, I'm going to copy this link instead of follow it in that way. Oh, no, I'm not. Give me a second. I'm going to share the proper screen with you. So this project has been going on for a number of years. We have been digitizing circus route books. And for those of you who aren't familiar with them, the route book was published at the end of a circus season, mostly by bigger circuses. And it would not only include the actual route, where they traveled for the year, but it would also include other kinds of information like the names of the people with the show, from the performers to the laborers, and some of the statistics about the show for the year. So for the Ringling show, to look at kind of how far they were traveling and some of those other pieces of information, we can go over to the side and search under circus title. And hopefully everybody is now seeing a screen with a lot of thumbnails of little books, and if not, let us know. So I've limited my search to Ringling Brothers. This project is still in process. It will ultimately include over 500 route books for various circuses that will date from, I believe it's like the 1870s up through even the 1950s in some cases, but they're kind of adding them a little bit at a time. So the Ringling Brothers, right now we have 13 route books up, but one of them that we have that is really fantastic is this route book of the Ringling Brothers show, 1882 to 1899. So this was published a little bit after the fact. The boys would not have put out anything like this in the early years because they really just didn't have the audience for that. But they did still keep records of those earliest years. So when you go into this interface, you can pull up any of these route books. And the nice thing is it allows for you to zoom in. And I think we can expand how much of the page we see. So you can see this 1882 season of the Ringling Brothers Classic and Comic Concert Company. It's what we all know as the beginnings, Mesomaney, Wisconsin, all of those words that you would have seen looking at Ringling family history are documented here in a publication that they put forth. So it's kind of nice to see that, but you can also start to get a sense of how short the season was. So 1882, they're playing in local theaters. And so you see, what is it, maybe about 15 shows on this page. Let me see if I can go to the next page. There we go. So another 10 to 15 shows, so less than 30 dates that they played on the hall shows in 1882. And you can go through these books and see year by year, what they were doing, what towns they were playing, how many days. Again, these are all one-day stands, even in the halls. So it's this amazing resource for that kind of information. What you can also find in it, so spring of 1885, Ringling Carnival of Fun. And they're starting to build out their show. And this one is a good example where they give you a little more information about what was happening with the show. So This one, 1885, is this first full year that they've decided to just be a circus. They're not trying to be a hall show as well. So there was a question that was asked about admission to the circus. In 1885, they're still charging 25 cents. I think it's the following year that they try to jump up to 50 cents, like the big shows of the day. But that season was especially bad. So they retreated back to 25 cents for another year or two. So depending on the size of the circus, your admission was going to be between 25 cents and 50 cents, even back in the 1880s. And so we've got the other information here about the size of the tent, about who are the proprietors. So we've got all 5 brothers listed here. And what I found was interesting is John's listed then again, that he's gone out ahead with horse and buggy. So by 1885, he's already decided that somebody needs to do the work out front and that he's the right person to do it. He's already kind of off into the world in this way. So he's doing the advance very early on. And then of course the names of the various performers with the show and the general opening and closing dates for it. So these route books are just tremendous resources for any kind of information you could want. Some of the pages will have additional information about any specific events that happened, and that actually starts playing out further into the text when you start to see at the end of 1886. I love this paragraph. So here at the end of 1886, John has left the show because he had to see the elephants. So he deserted, as they say, 5 days before the show closed. And he went specifically to buy 2 elephants for the circus. And it was a big deal to have those. That was kind of this moment where they clearly had made it. And they start to announce the numbers of elephants they have and the numbers of animals they have in other descriptions of the show. So I'm going to bounce back to the PowerPoint. And like I said, I will share all of these resources because the route books, to me, I could spend days being lost in this. So we did that. Another question that was asked, which was not answered in the route books, was about where the Ringlings got the money to buy the Barnum and Bailey show. So they paid over $400,000 for the show in 1906, actually, is when the deal begins. 1907 is when it's all signed. And it's pointed out that, you know, that's a lot of money for the day. So I went looking through my resources to see what I could find in terms of how they would have paid for that. And the Jerry Apps book, Ringlinville, USA, which I know is a text that we've referred everyone to many times over, is really excellent. It's a very readable volume, and Apps worked with Fred Dollinger, who's an extraordinary circus historian in and of himself. And they really culled through all of the right resources to get these stories together. So he makes mention that Otto, who was very supportive of the purchase of Barnum and Bailey show, knew that they wouldn't be able to make a loan of that size in Baraboo. So he went out into the world, and he didn't have any success in St. Louis. So he contacted a New York bank to lend the brothers $360,000. Because there were some runs on the money, it was a financially depressed period then as well. The bank was only willing to give $355,000 up front, and the other $5,000 for some reason they wanted to keep liquid, I suppose, in their assets. And so that came later. But the season before that, and this is also in the Apps book, the brothers had netted almost $800,000 by the close of their season. So getting those loans, it was more a matter of finding a bank that had the resources to share that than it was them showing that they had the credit to do it. Again, just really interesting information that Jerry Apps has pulled together. We talked about what the ticket cost was, and you can see that both in the route book and also in the newspaper advertisements that I looked at. A lot of times it'll mention the cost of the tickets. So in terms of how much performers were paid, I went and found another resource. I actually just did a Google search for circus performers contracts. So I'm going to show you that result and what I pulled up. Okay, so you should be seeing a Google search page right now. And I did the search generally, but I landed in Google Books to find something specific. So I got results from this book, Women in the American Circus, which is, again, a volume I'm familiar with. I know that they did their research on it, so it's a pretty good usable resource. And I was looking through it, and it's got great general information. So to find out how much performers made in any time period, you really have to go to the contracts, to the physical objects, which I can't do because they're in the vault, and our collection of them is fairly limited. There are many more at Circus World and Baraboo. So I know that these authors did their research, and in here, it's got some really great perspective on it. Here in this bottom paragraph, contracts for young and single ballet girls, it basically comes down to saying that they make $8 a week, but they also get room and board. And then there it was, that was the page. So here's where it says in this paragraph, $8 a week for this ballet girl in 1912. Clowns, again, because there were multitudes of them in that period, were something similar. They really got a very small amount of pay, but they were working to have a place to live and food to eat. As performers reach higher levels, she goes into these other performers. Jean and Mary Enos are perch pole performers, which is actually like Big Andy, what we saw with these performers up at the top of a pole. And in 1913, they wrote to the Ringlings asking for $85 a week plus the room and board that comes with the circus. And they didn't get it from Ringling, but they got it from the competitors, Hagenbach Wallace. And then for somebody who was more of a center ring star, like Lillian Lietzel, the aerialist, you can see that at 1915, she was making $200 a week while the show was in Chicago, in a city, and then $150 a week on the road, because that's where the show was really housing her, on the train and in the private tent. By 1931, she's up to $350 a week with all kinds of extra luxuries. What I love about Lillian's contract is they've exerted some of the text here. Miss Lietzel is to be excused from tournament and parade. In other words, she doesn't have to do any extra work. That's, she comes and does her act, and that is it. So doing some basic searches can get you a lot of these answers. It just, as I tell my kids all the time, you just have to know your sources, or you have to look broadly back and forth between a lot of different things to understand what you're reading. So I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint. There are other resources that I've put in here, including the Circus Historical Society's website. To save time a little, I'm going to skip going into this, but the Bandwagon Index, or maybe I should just go over to it for a second. Laura, am I doing okay on time?
Yeah, you're doing great.
Okay.
We're
good.
with you.
Okay.
As much time as you need.
You're all awake. I can't see anybody's faces because I'm doing all of this sharing. And so if I'm boring anybody to tears, please tell me. I could spend hours doing this kind of thing.
This is great. We're totally into it.
Okay, wonderful. So I'm sure a lot of you have heard of the Circus Historical Society. They are a kind of marvelous group. I'm a member, very proud member, and was editing the Bandwagon Journal for a number of years. And most of the core membership of this has always been these people who love circus history so much that they want to spend all of their time diving into the minutia of it. And so as a result, they give us tremendous amounts of information, kind of very factual information. And so when I was asked about what kind of animals were on the show, and that question was about the 1920s, and I have to admit I haven't done all the digging to get right to that, but I went to the Bandwagon Index, which I'll show you in a second, and I found this very quickly. The Ringling Barnum train loading order from 1932. So Gordon Potter, the author of this, and this article was published in 1959. Gordon Potter, huge circus fan. He was a great historian on wagons and the logistics of the circus. And so what he's done here is actually really done the work of going through photos and probably loading lists and other documents that were produced by the circus to tell us all about the circus train for that year. And so he gives the top part is kind of an overview where he gives some information, but then he literally makes a list for us of what the train looked like, which I think is, you know, imagine the Howard brothers circus, and you can kind of see this play out in the first section of the train. These are the flat car numbers that are down the side, and then each wagon that was actually loaded onto that car is listed here. What's great about the circus and circus historians is they get as much detail as they can. So on the section of that train that held the cages, we actually have all of the various cage wagons, and you can see what animals were in them: hyenas, tigers, gnus, kangaroos, all of these different animals. I think I counted them, and it's something like 25 different types of animals, but you can see there are 2 different wagons carrying a rhinoceros, and I think tigers, again, tigers, you would have had a couple of tigers in a cage separated out, and there are several cage wagons with tigers because they would have had them performing that year too. So when you go into these train listings, you can find out all about the specific animals. I love they have macaws. There was something else I thought was just kind of, I think further down, the porcupines. That was the one that really got me. We have in the front of the Howard Brothers Circus, there are the little tiny cage wagons right there at the front, and they're called the Children's Menagerie. And that's where you would have had something like a porcupine, that some smaller animals that maybe people would have seen in the wild within the States, but you know, city children might never have seen them. So like I said, the kind of research that these circus historians have done is phenomenal, and really can give you a lot of great insight. You'll see this is the index for articles from 57 to 99. And in the notes field, it tells you which ones are available online. So you can do a search on a page like this. If you do, on a Mac, it's Command F. On a PC, I believe it's Control F. You get a field up at the top where you can put in a search term for, let's say we search for the band. And you see we get 186 matches because it's also pulling up bandwagon and all of these kinds of things. But you can scroll through easily and start to see what kind of articles, like what is the Algae Barnes electric bandwagon? And those, you can just follow those links through. I say this, and of course that one does not take me immediately to the article. It usually loads it, there it is, loads it right up to where that article is, and learn all kinds of wonderful facts about circus history. And so all of these that I've shown you to this point are available to you as you sit at home. You don't have to do anything special to access them other than have the information. Let me go back to the PowerPoint. So we've gone through those. And this is the other one that I wanted to share with you all, because I think all of you will enjoy this. You can search from home the Herald Tribune, the historic Herald Tribune paper. And this one I was looking for information about winter quarters. So this website is available through Sarasota County. You will have to set up a free account in order to access it, but there's no cost to it. So if you're interested in doing any kind of research on Sarasota history, this is a great place to go. So like I said, you can see the county, and over here I'm already logged in, but that's where you go to set up an account. And it was really easy. It didn't ask me for any kinds of credit cards or anything like that. So I strongly encourage you to make use of this for any kind of research. And it offers, the Herald Tribune is the one that I go to the most often, but you can see it's a lot of the local newspapers. So there's a lot of good information that can be picked up here. Actually, I'm going to leave it set to all of them, and I'm going to do a search for Ringling quarters between, let's just say, 27 to 1930, just to get a sense of what's there. So its interface isn't quite as slick as the Chronicling America one, and sometimes the text recognition is a little weird. You can see in the second one, it's got this P in front of Ringling. It doesn't always read things quite as well as some others do, but it can still give you plenty to look through. So here at Ringling Homes and Museum, there's a story there that would tie to our history here, and you can, all of the controls for it are pretty easy. Okay, so this is local advertising, tells visitors of the city's charms, and they're talking about the Museum of Art as well as the winter quarters being part, even back in 1929, of the things that would draw people to Sarasota. So I was using this to look for the question about Ringling winter quarters and what kind of programs they offered. So what it was is visitors could come to winter quarters when the show was not out on the road. So basically from about November to early March, they were able to come out to the winter quarters, and most of the week they would come in and just whatever was happening at the moment was what you could see. If someone was practicing a riding act, then you could go see that. Or if the elephants were out, but you weren't guaranteed anything. On Sunday afternoons, they would offer a performance. So if you bought your admission to winter quarters on Sunday afternoons, you could see whatever kind of circus performance they put together. There was never, at least that I've seen, a hard program of what was going to be offered. It was kind of what was available, what was ready, and maybe even what needed practicing, because with a lot of circus animals, you want to keep them in a routine of performance to make sure that they stay comfortable with it. But the information I found here in the historic newspapers, you could find mentions of, at least not in the searches I've run up to this point. But I do think this is, having this resource of the Herald Tribune, the historic paper online, is a really fascinating way to do history about the whole community. Okay, so I'm going to jump back to the PowerPoint now. And so hopefully you see the PowerPoint screen again. And I pulled this article out about the winter quarters, and you can see down here in the third paragraph that the weekly Sunday afternoon performances of the animals and stars. So most of the questions that we got from all of you about this program was information about the specific brothers. I don't have a lot of new information to share. I'll show you a little bit about the various brothers, but one resource I wanted to point out to all of you, and maybe you have a copy of this article. I think we've shared it at various times during docent trainings, but I think it's really, again, an important resource, because this is a 1919 article that was published in the American Magazine. So this is where we get so many of the best quotes that we attribute to John Ringling. And, you know, we divided the job, it stuck together is a really important part of how we interpret how the brothers made their successful business. And this article gives you the overview of how John Ringling saw that. On this page, and you can see the top of the paragraph. I'm going to stop playing with it because I don't want to keep jumping all over the place. One thing which we agreed upon early was that the majority rule should not prevail in all cases. And he goes on to talk about the fact that the brothers had decided that if one of them came up with an idea or a process that they wanted to work through, it wouldn't be struck down just because the others didn't agree. They would talk it out, and everybody would have an opportunity to really, really work at it. And if that one brother felt that it was critical, even though everyone else didn't go for it, they would give it a try. Whether that always played out, who knows? You know, that's John's interpretation, but that they even had that attitude. They valued one another enough that they were never going to dismiss the possibility that this person had an idea that could be transformative. And that probably is what really led to the purchase of the Barnum and Bailey, because it was John and Otto. The other brothers were happy with the success they had with the Ringling show. I don't think they had the same kind of big kind of conquering dreams that John and Otto perhaps had. They would have been content with the success they already had, but Otto and John wanted it, and they talked it through and realized that they could do it and that it could grow their business. And so ultimately that's what happened. But this article goes on for pages about how he worked with his brothers, about how he works with circus people, about what what the audiences want. So it's one that I definitely encourage you to take the time to read if you haven't already, or revisit it, because it is, again, it's kind of a foundational way of thinking about the brothers. So back to my PowerPoint. So these are the questions that came in about the individuals, but it was really about what were their individual responsibilities, what were they like. So most of the brothers were super private. It's hard to find out much beyond these basic volumes that we use. Al is one that I've been kind of digging into that Chronicling America site to find out more. I love this one. So this is June 1883, the Wood County Reporter. So I think Wood County is still in Wisconsin. It might be in Iowa. So although they've already embarked on their circus career at that point, Al would go out and perform with other shows because he was the one that was a performer from the start. And so we see here an announcement that the Great Grecian Show gave 2 exhibitions in the city, and it talks about the balancing feats that Al Ringling performed. And you can find other references to Al performing either on a tightrope or a wire, or sometimes it's balancing feats. There are references within the newspaper. Oh, this one has it with the balancing the plow on his chin, which is a story that's picked up by Plowden and by Ringling Bill. So you can start to see where he kind of became a performer on his own by digging into these little stories along the way. So I've included in this PowerPoint the label text that's actually up in the historic galleries. And I did this because these texts were actually written originally by Pat Ringling Buck. And so they have a little bit, she's a great niece of the Ringling brothers. They have a little bit of a personal flair to them. There's a little bit of the family narrative in them all. Some even more than others, but I think you get this sense Lythan Quick, his innate instinct for timing and precision and his production skills made him an outstanding equestrian director. I feel like what she wrote gives a good idea of the person or a feeling of them. On the tops of the slides, I've pulled out kind of the facts that we know. And for Al, it really is about the performance. He was the one that was most invested in what was happening in the ring or around the ring, because he himself, I think, was a performer at heart. He was the one, as equestrian director for the early shows, he was the one that would organize the program, would decide what act followed another. And he was really, he and his wife Lou, obviously, because she was a performer as well, stayed really tightly connected to the performance community. They were very realistic about what the needs were there. They were very attached emotionally to the performers that worked with the show. And because of that, and I think probably just somewhat his personality, Al was really attached to the community of Baraboo. So he is the brother there. When you go to Baraboo, Al Ringling is like John Ringling is here in Sarasota. Al is the one they talk about. The theater is there because he left it to the town. His home is there. It's embedded in the fiber of Baraboo, how important the brothers in general were, but Al specifically. Otto is probably the most elusive of the Ringling brothers. There is really very little written. You don't get much. He didn't go out and do any kind of press, and he wasn't necessarily really evident in the early shows. And in fact, from the reading that I've done, it seemed like Otto did not really go out on the show very frequently. He kind of stayed at the home offices, either in Baraboo, or once they grew bigger, they had offices in Chicago, and then ultimately, with the greatest show on earth, out in New York. So he tended to stay off the road. He was apparently very bookish. He liked to read. He liked horses and apparently betting on horses. But that's really all we know about Otto. He did not marry, and all of the descriptions really focus on the fact that he was the business mind, and he was so intent on creating a successful business that he did not build a personal life beyond that for himself. There was some question about what that meant. Was he a confirmed bachelor as a euphemism for something else? I don't think there's any way to answer that. I think he was a very private person, and also really just a great business mind, maybe to the point that that was all that occupied his head. So there's not much more than we know about Otto, but he was loved by his brothers. I think he might have been the most respected in terms of the business mind. John obviously grew into that role after Otto was gone, because Otto was the first one to pass away in 1911. But it really was his acumen that propelled them to the top of the show world.
Jennifer, sorry,
yeah.
We have a question in the chat box. Joyce wanted to know if Al ever lived in Sarasota.
No, Al did not. Alf T had a home here, but not Al. Al never lived outside of Baraboo once the show got started, to my knowledge. I'll double check that though, Joyce, in case I'm wrong. And so Alf T was described really as kind of the artistic mind and the writer of the family. He, again, didn't seem to travel with the show a tremendous amount after the early years. I should say that with the very earliest years, and you see this in the route books that I showed you and in any of the books that you read, all of the brothers were on the road early because they were all part of the performance. They didn't have anybody else working for them. So they all played instruments with the show, and they all actually performed in some capacity. But as soon as the show started growing, Otto went off the road. John seemed to step out of performance pretty quickly. I think it was it 1888 that we saw him going ahead of the show, working in advance. So those two and Alf T really seemed to pull back from traveling with the show on a regular basis. Alf instead was out there meeting newspapermen and sharing stories about the Ringling brothers. So he did all the PR work and kind of went ahead to build up interest in the show. He also did a lot of the writing for the spectacles of the circuses. So those kinds of plays that would happen before the actual circus performance, Alf T, would often script those and create these kind of wonderful scenes. There's a newspaper article, which I could not hunt down today, but I'll try and find it, that is an interview with Alf T about creating the spectacle. So it's an interesting insight. He's thinking about narratives and theatrical work, which does really tie back to their very earliest years when they're in the halls performing, because there they were doing a combination of kind of plays as well as acrobatics and tumbling and music, of course. So Alf T also goes east with John and Otto, working with the Barnum and Bailey show. And he did have a home down in this area, and then also had the home in Oak Ridge, New Jersey. He had one child. The only ones of the Ringling brothers to have children are Alf T, of these 5 founding brothers, I should be more specific. Alf T has the one son, Richard Ringling, and then Charles has his 2 children. So the other brothers are really focused on their business. Charles is, after Al, maybe, the brother that I would love to have met, because he seemed to be very humane. He was after Al, the one that was the closest to the performers. He was the one, he worked the front door on the show from the time that he stopped performing in any way. And reading through last night, I found a note that I've put up here, that I knew he was an accomplished musician. He played the horn. It's a little, I don't know if it's cornet or a trumpet, and also the violin. And he played on the show in a performance at least once per season every year of his life, which I think is pretty awesome that he kept that tie to it. What's interesting is as the brothers passed away, Charles and John, the youngest, who really are the ones that diversified the most, and his obituary labels him as both the financier and railroad builder, as well as a showman. So it's, their identities are expanding in these ways. I'm racing through these. I will again remind you, we'll share that text. It's the label text that is there in the Circus Museum too, but it is just a nice way to get a sense of who the brothers were. And John, I think we all have a sense of John. What struck me is, how early, and really from the very start, they talk about John joined the show late in its first season. He always seemed to make his own choices, even though he worked very well with his brothers. But as soon as it was possible, as soon as it was necessary, he moved to Chicago to run an office for the show there, to be in the big city. When he was able to, he jumped to the East Coast, to New York, and immediately became involved in so many other things with Madison Square Garden and the boxing matches. I think John always was the most individual of the brothers. He really had a vision of his own life that included the work of the Ringling brothers as a unit. And I think understanding more about the brothers and how they all worked together and what their focuses were really helps illuminate that he was his own character. It's fitting that he was the final one, because I think he always kind of wanted that level of attention in a way that none of the other brothers seemed to chase after with the same enthusiasm. So that's kind of a overview of the brothers. Again, just for resources, looking through all this helped me start to really get a handle on the family tree. But in the Circus Kings, they have this, which does help understand kind of all the interrelations, and just having a document like that, a family tree where you can really see the names in relation to each other, is really helpful to me. So the Circus Kings was another book that I saw on Amazon Kindle for, I think, under $2. So if you're looking for reads, those are good ones to come back to. And I think I brought this up in case there were any questions about those volumes and these resources. So I'm gonna stop sharing my screen, if I can remember how to do that. There we go. And kind of open it up for a few minutes. One thing that I'm gonna keep doing is just researching these kind of strange questions that I get really interested in. And so I kind of wondered over the course of this if there were questions that seemed like minutia that came up for anybody else that I should be looking for, or that you all might go out and look for.
Was Ida ever involved with the circus? Her son, John Ringling North, was very much part of it, but was his mother involved at all?
His mother was not, but their father had some of the business dealings. So there was an involvement to some degree, even when the boys were young. But it was more that John Ringling North and Henry Ringling North were taken out on the show from the time that they were teenagers and given jobs. That the uncles loved their mother so much. But no, none of Lou Ringling, Al's wife, is probably the only one of the women in the family who you can see a really clear connection. And then Edith, after John's death, of course, kind of steps up, but that's really with her son, trying to position things that way.
Okay, all right.
Jennifer?
Yes.
You talked about the winter quarters in Sarasota, that they would do Sunday performances. Mm-hmm. The funds that they charged the audience, were those kept by the performers, or were they given to the Ringling? It's also my understanding that some of those performances were used or given to St. Martha's Church to build the U.S. Circus Church in the United States.
So that's a great question. There's probably a couple of answers. They definitely did shows to help raise funds for St. Martha's. We have some photos of them in the collection, and the photos that we have were taken at a performance that was outdoors on the site of St. Martha's. So we see that would have been its own separate thing, the special fundraising, but it was something that the Ringling Enterprise supported. The actual shows out at winter quarters, I've never seen a document, but I'm going to go with my gut that the ticket sales went to the show itself. And I would imagine then that the contract for performers must have included pay for the time that they're at winter quarters, because some of them during that season would have been off doing other circuses. The shrine circuses performed a lot of times through the winter. So not everybody would have been there, but the performers that had to have been rolled into a contract in some way. They may also have had the opportunity to sell souvenirs of some sort. Sometimes when we find various kinds of photos of performers, those were sold by that person to add to their own income.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Hi, Ingrid here.
Yeah.
Can you tell me where we can find the article, "We Divided the Job But Stuck Together"?
It's going to be I have the link embedded in this PowerPoint. So it's kind of messy to try and tell you it right off the top, but we'll email it out to you.
Oh, that's great. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Jennifer, we also have another question in the chat box. Do you have a document of the operations of the circus after John's death? Who was in control and made the sale to Feld?
Well, so I don't have one specific document for that, but the operations of the show after John's death get a little bit messy, honestly. And it's a period that I don't know inside and out, so I'll kind of give a really quick overview. When John died, there's obviously the problems that there were multiple versions of the will. The North brothers were generally considered to be the natural heirs to running the circus, but because the other Ringling brothers had had children, there was an interest from Charles's family to maintain control. So there was a bit of a battle for a while between the Norths and Richard Ringling. I keep getting confused. One is Robert and one is Richard, but Charles's son, to manage the circus. And the Norths took it over from 36 up until 42 and ran it, but then it went under Charles's son for a couple of years with less success. John Ringling North in those first years from 36 to 42 had made a lot of changes, had modernized the circus with Norman Bell Geddes and Miles White. And so the traditionalists, which the circus community is filled with the idea that there's a tradition you have to stick with until it changes and everybody thinks there's a new tradition. So Charles's family really represented trying to go back to what it had been before the Norths, and that no longer fit with American society. So ultimately, John Ringling North took back control of the circus, and I think it's 48 that he comes back in, and he managed it then until the sale to Feld. So in 1968, November of 1967 is when the contract is signed between John Ringling North and Irvin and Israel Feld and their partner, Judge Roy Hoffines, who was the man behind the Houston Astrodome. So the Felds knew how to put live entertainment into buildings. Judge Hoffines knew how to build buildings that would contain large entertainment. So they were natural partners for that. And they had actually been working with the Norths for almost a decade, helping to actually schedule the Ringling show once it had moved out from canvas and into arenas. So they'd had a long relationship, and John Ringling North felt that he was putting it in good hands with people who would keep up the tradition of it and who knew the business of traveling live entertainment into buildings in a way that he never, I think, was comfortable with.
And that was in 1968?
So 67 is when they signed the contract. I know this because many of you have probably seen it. There's this wonderful circus photo, right, of this contract signing in the Roman Colosseum, the home of the original historic circus, ancient circus. And so you have John Ringling North and the Feld brothers and the judge and a little lion cub signing. It's a great PR stunt. So November of 67 is the signature. 1968 is the first show that the Felds, technically are the producers of, but it was already assembled by North's team. So it's not the first show that really has the mark of the Felds. That would be in 69 when he brings Gunther Gable Williams and they have 2 units. So it's a little squishy, the dates, the way they work there.
I hope they put the paw print of the cub on the contract as well.
I've never seen a copy of the contract. I'll have to find out if they maybe have that anywhere, but it's a great photo.
So the Felds have had control and ownership since 1967?
Yes. Yeah, again, it's the end of 67. So, but yes.
Right. Impressive.
Yeah, they were, when the show closed, they were in the 50th year. So, and the Feld family has gone through 3 generations of managing the circus, where the Ringlings only went through 2. So, it was a tremendously long run. And with perspective now and a little time, I think that the instinct that must have compelled John Ringling North to sell, which partially was that he'd reached a point he wanted to retire, right? He had the money, and I think he was tired of the business and probably missed the tented circus that he'd grown up with. But the Felds understood how to transform the circus for a building, because I always say the tented circus, has its own magic, right? You wake up in the morning and all of a sudden the city is being erected on the empty lot. Like, there's something so beautiful about that image, that when you take away the tents and the circus just goes into a building that's always been there, how do you build the same excitement for it? And I don't think that the Ringling family necessarily knew how to answer that, because they'd always had the tents. The Felds, on the other hand, had always been in buildings. And so Irvin Feld created tremendous spectacles. The kind of money he poured into just sequins alone probably is, amazing. But he then transformed the interiors of those buildings in ways that still brought the magic of the circus.
Why did the circus end recently? What was the main reason? Was it cruelty to animals or other groups, or?
The animal rights issues had plagued American circuses in general. Certainly the Ringling Brothers show, there were a lot of concerns there and a lot of court battles that cost money, but that wasn't ultimately it. They retired the elephants from the road in 2016, the year before the shows actually closed. And that was, it was in part a reaction to animal rights, but it was even more so, I think, a financial decision. Traveling elephants is an extraordinarily big undertaking. You have to pay licenses every time you cross a state line. You have to make sure that you're taking good care of them. You have to have all of these inspections, which the Ringling Show did. Their elephants were wonderfully cared for. At the Elephant Conservation Center, I was talking to one of their representatives, and she explained to me they'd had a retired elephant, one that had aged out from the road from performing. And when they got her to the center, she never found a community. She wasn't happy with the other elephants there. So they ultimately put her back and let her travel with the circus and just not perform. So they really were looking at what the needs were. But it was so costly to do that. And then I think in 2017, it was the cost, not having the elephants somewhat hurt ticket sales, but the costs were again jumping to move trains over state lines. So all of these things fed into the thinking about the circus. And from what I've been told, it had been quite a long time since the circus was the money maker for Feld Entertainment. The other entertainments like Disney on Ice and some of these other shows really were what supported their ability to put the circus out on the road. And I think the balance tipped to a point that they couldn't justify it anymore. So, and today, in this moment of time, I don't know what the future looks like for any live entertainment. It's hit the news that Feld Entertainment had to release or furloughed 90% of their staff. And obviously we don't know when we as a community will even feel safe again being in an environment with that many people. And yet Circus Arts, they're doing wonderful things online. I mean, on Facebook, on Instagram, you can go. Circus Arts Conservatory is doing wonderful programming, and other performers are. I saw a story about one clown who's doing a one-man circus in community roundabouts. So he'll go set up in the middle of the roundabout and let the families sit on their lawns and watch his show. So they're finding ways, but it's going to be a hard thing for them to come back from.
About Lillian Litzel, there are so many wild stories about her second husband, her third husband. She chopped her second husband's finger off. Her third husband, after she died, they married another woman who killed.
Yes. Lillian Litzel, the aerialist, was, I mean, she must have been a force of nature in every way. And her history does read like a soap opera. There's a book that was written that's Mostly historical fact. I think it plays a little bit. Queen of the Air was written by Dean Jensen, and he's another very good circus historian. So I think that he elaborates some elements of her story, but she's the one, she married Alfredo Cadona, who was another aerial star of the age, and they were both beautiful people and they passionately in love, but they fought all the time and everything. I mean, they really do sound like a soap opera. When she fell in Copenhagen, when she had the accident that would ultimately bring about her death, Cadona rushed to her side. He had been performing in Paris, I think it was, and she assured him that she was okay. And so he went back to perform. What's that?
I think it was Berlin where she was there.
Maybe. But I know that he went back because the show must go on. So he went back to perform, and she died, that day. He had her buried in California under this beautiful monument of an angel lifting a beautiful woman up to the sky, as an aerialist would. And then, yes, he married somebody else from his troupe not long after, who then wanted to divorce him, and he met her in the lawyer's office, and he shot her and killed himself. So terribly sordid stories, but there's talk of a movie being made of her life, and it seems kind of ripe for that, honestly.
Betty Hutton does a good what do you call those
plans
in that movie, The Greatest Show on Earth.
If we ever want to watch a movie as a big group, right, this is The Greatest Show on Earth would give us something like 3 hours of movie time. But the scenes like that were filmed here used a lot of local performers. And so the planche, which is where you hang by one arm and rotate your body up and over in perfect form, in the film, it's actually performed by Norma Fox, La Norma, who still lives here in Sarasota.
Betty Hutton. Oh.
No, Betty Hutton was afraid of heights. Whenever they had a scene with her on a trapeze, they couldn't lift it more than 2 feet off the ground. So, but Lenorma performed this planche. Lietzel could do a couple hundred of those rotations if she got going. Lenorma told me once that she could only do about 12 of them. So if you watch the movie, it's actually a loop repeating over and over of the same performance. So there's an inside scoop for you all on The Greatest Show on Earth. When I started my job here, well, before I started actually as an employee, I was an intern, and I was asked to work on the 50th anniversary of The Greatest Show on Earth. So I got to sit down and watch the movie with Norma Fox and with Jackie LeClaire and these performers from the community who had been part of it. And they told me all the inside scoops of where you could see the shadows of booms and why Betty Hutton, you never see the ground, like, you never see perspective when she's on the trapeze because she was terrified, and she was apparently not very nice to the performers. They didn't like Betty. Oh, I'm seeing some chats come up.
And I know we've taken up a lot of your time, Jennifer. Maybe if you want to answer just this one last question from the chat, which is how many people traveled with the circus, which is a big question, and then maybe we'll wrap up.
Sounds good. Yeah, so that is a hard thing to answer because it obviously changes over time. We have it in the Howard Brothers Circus. So that's when the Ringling Brothers Circus is the biggest that it travels under canvas. And in that period of time, there were about 1,500 people that traveled with the circus. Of that number, somewhere around 300 of them were the performers. And everything else is the support crew that's needed to, put up the city, to handle the animals, to do all of the other parts of the circus day, the ushers and the band members and all of those. So it really was a traveling city when it was like that. As soon as you move into buildings, you have a lot less needs for people. So even when the show is at its biggest in buildings, you're looking at, maybe 400 or 500 people traveling with the show at that point in time. So I appreciate all of you taking the time to be here, and I hope that it's been a nice hour or so to fill. I've had fun kind of going through some of my process. We'll share the document, and Erin and Laura can also direct questions towards me if there's anything that kind of comes up along the way, and maybe we'll do another one of these sometime in the near future.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. This was
Excellent.
great.
Thank you. It was wonderful.
Thank you all so much. That's great. It really has been nice. So
Thank you. It was very, very
It was
informative.
really great. Thank you.
thank you. Everybody stay well.
Thank
And you.
You too.